Hello, everyone. This is Wyland with the FPV podcast. I'm back again. And for this wrap up episode of the DRL Level 4 or Drone Racing League Boston Foundry, I'm going to be combining episodes 7 and 8 together. Just because of the schedule in which it was broadcast, it was just much easier to combine the two. So that's what I'll be doing. So this is the final episode of the regular season, and now we're going into the playoffs. So there's definitely some extra stress for the pilots that are on the bubble, which is proving to be quite a lot of pilots, but we'll get to that in episode 8. For episode 7, I kind of want to cover some overarching big topics that we've seen throughout the 4 levels that we've been watching. And one of the things that you've noticed is that we're progressing towards more smaller, closer tracks, and also 2 laps. We started off with Miami, which is 1 lap, and then we went to Atlanta, which is 1 lap, and then now the last 2 is 2 laps, and they're much more restricted. There's a lot more natural obstacles which punish you when the pilots go outside of the racing line, predefined racing lines, as I think of it. There's less chance for the pilots to push hard, be able to recover, and try to keep racing. It's one of those things where, do you really want to see a pilot only race within a restricted limit? It's one of those things where if you have a big open area, pilots can try new racing lines, new concepts, new positions in order to try to pass a person. But with these restrictions, any single time they go outside of these predefined racing lines, they get punished, which means races in general, I think, tend to slow down, and then they speed back up, and then what you'll see is a lot of mid-air collisions in between, because people are trying to figure this out, right? All the pilots are trying to figure this out. They go fast, they crash because of racing lines. They go slower, they get more mid-airs. So now it's like this, I wouldn't want to call it luck, but it feels like luck, in which you don't know what strategy is going to work out. You're just going to go ahead, get into the air, and whatever happens, you have to determine what strategy is good at that moment. I guess that's the best way to say it. I'm not sure if it's right or not. Personally, I don't really like these short, narrow corridor 2-lap races. I find that it gets really repetitive, and I find that the pilots aren't as creative, and there are moments in the race which you just know the pilots would rather follow the person and try to wait for a mistake and pass then, and just stay in that position, which, I mean, like in a lot of professional racing, that's the way it is. But when your heats are only a minute long, that really doesn't provide the kind of, racing that would be very watchable over the long term. I feel like the pilots every single time should be able to wow you if the racing is only 1 minute long. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm actually right, because I'm still trying to figure that out. It's like, is it actually good? Like the Miami race, I feel like is the best one that they have so far, because this is the second time they used the Miami stadium. So now it's building up a reputation. It has a heritage. And that's what other racing leagues have that we don't have right now in drone racing, is that we don't have that heritage. The tracks themselves aren't a part of the story. At least with the Miami Stadium, there's kind of a story to be told, because now there's 2 races. If they bring it back in 2018, there'll be 3 races there. There is a story already there based around the stadium. There's a culture that can be built around that, and a fan base that can be built around that. If none of the other venues are repeats, then it's kind of hard to build that type of, culture, or that heritage around that racing. So I think this is one of the problems that the Drone Racing League is going to have to tackle, is that how are they going to make it so that each venue has, it's not just a venue with a track that they build that's unique, that's one-off, that really has no significance, in my opinion. When you race there multiple times and then there's actually some heritage to it, I think that adds another element, but at the same time, it might not be the right element that they're looking for. I'm not sure about that. All right, enough about that stuff. Let's go ahead and get into some of the racing. One of the things that you'll notice is that the superstars are all kind of on the bench, with the exception of A-Nub. He's the only superstar that I can see of that it didn't race in level 3. So it's a little weird watching Group 1, right? Because these are the people that, they're highly stressed. They have a lot to lose because they're all on the bubble, or the vast majority of them are on the bubble. But when you watch them race and you don't have the names that you've been following for the last 3 levels, it kind of feels like you're watching the B team. And that's not really good television. I know, because I watch drone racing a lot, that any of these pilots are still super good and they can win on any given Sunday. But it just doesn't feel like you're watching the B team because the pilots that you've been following for the last 3 levels are all on the bench. It just feels weird. Now you transition over to Group 2 where you have Anub in there, and then all of a sudden McStrawley finally is coming into his own. I think he's finally getting into the groove of what he needs to do to win in the Drone Racing League. All of a sudden that group felt completely different from Group 1. There was a different atmosphere in terms of watching the entertainment of the racing. So it's a little weird. I don't know if they actually broke that up properly, and it might be something that they learned from. But Group 1 was definitely underwhelming, but Group 2 was, well, it was more entertaining. But the race between McStrawley and Anub was a little weird, right? For McStrawley, his strategy was kind of what Gab was already doing. They kind of talk about that in episode 8. But Anub was playing it safe. I think he just exuded so much confidence in this particular level. I think he knew going from the inset that with this technical track and with his experience, he had a really good chance of getting first place, excellent chance of podium. So it was like the strategist versus the person that's trying to prove that he's fast and can still stay in the air while still maintaining control. So it was entertaining for Group 2, but it was still not like up to the levels of the last few episodes that we've been watching. The last thing I want to say about this episode is actually the analog feed that they showed. And for anybody who's ever used FPV indoors in a metal building, the analog feed that they showed while having 6 pilots up was pretty amazing. I'm sure like the audience who doesn't fly FPV, they looked at it and says, why is it so grainy? Why is it so terrible? But for anybody who does fly, it's like, wow, that is like some great multipathing, non-interference that they're seeing. It's very flyable and it's really good looking. I don't know what DRL has in store for, product launches, but they should definitely start thinking about selling VTXs and receivers if that's the kind of quality they can get at any building inside, because there's definitely a market of FPV racers that would love to have that technology, because like racing indoors with analog right now kind of sucks. And really the only way around it is to go Connex, in which you have like amazing video, but you're talking about some, really expensive equipment to outrig all of your quads, and also very heavy equipment. But the analog, I found it to be very interesting, and I personally hope that they release a product there, because I think they could really dominate the market if that's the type of feed that you can get consistently anywhere indoors, solving that multipathing problem. All right, let's get into episode 8, which is the finals. So we have Anub, McStrawley, 32 bits, Jaws, Duncan, and Falcon X. And let's go ahead and start this off with talking about the pilots, because I haven't done that a long time, and I always say the pilots are the most important things in all the episodes. One interesting thing is that there's like 2 separate races going on at the same time, and then there's a third element, which is a race-off in order to try to get enough points for the people that are all tied for 11th place to get into the playoffs, which I'll discuss at the end a little bit. But it was really fun watching this episode. It was much better than episode 7. Episode 7 just felt kind of like B grade, and this jumped it back up to the A grade that you expect for the Drone Racing League. Anub and McStrawley, 2 very, very fast pilots, and they seem to be in their element when it comes to tight technical tracks. And watching them race against each other is pretty amazing. One thing to note was that the FPV view, while it wasn't good for certain other tracks because it was too wide open and there was nothing really to show for the FPV view on that, for tight courses like that, them using the FPV view all the time, I think is actually pretty excellent. It was actually a lot more fun than watching the line of sight cameras in there, in my opinion. I think they should actually, if they're going to go with more the tight technical tracks like they did with level 3 and level 4, I think the FPV view is so important for the footage to make it entertaining. They should do everything they can to make that footage look good. And what I'm talking about is lighting, because these GoPro cameras, they do perform pretty well in the dark, but they still need a good amount of light to actually give that HD quality feel. So I feel like they actually hit a sweet spot there, in which they figured out that, you know what, for wide open tracks, it's really nice to have these line of sight cameras to be able to capture that speed and also the different elements of different lines that the pilots are using. But for tight technical tracks, I feel like the FPV view is much better off, and it's just much more fun to watch. If they can just improve upon the image quality a little bit, I think a lot of people will really enjoy watching the entire race in FPV view. But that's my personal opinion on that. But watching A-Nub and McStrawley fly together and try to battle it out is pretty cool. The second group, really, 32-bit Jaws and Duncan, they're really I consider them like the fun group to watch, because like they take over what Wild Willy usually is for me, is that they're the wild cards, right? On any given heat, they can be first or they can crash out. And a lot of it is due to the fact that they're struggling with trying to figure out where they are on the track in relation to everybody else, because it's so easy in the middle of the pack to crash out, because one, you feel like somebody's pressuring you, or two, somebody mid-airs you, or three, you just lose your concentration a little bit and you're off your line and you crash out. And what was kind of interesting is Jaws, who won, congratulations to him, the Indie boys are representing really well, is that, you know, being consistent, again, showed that you can win. You know, Nurk did that really well for his levels, and now what Jaws is showing is that as long as you're consistent, you get into those, you know, second and third place, you always give yourself a chance at the end to take it. And, you know, he took advantage of other pilots' mistakes, and that's what ultimately gave him the win. It's so interesting. 32 bits, I feel like he's actually starting to fly a lot faster. He looks like he's flying with a lot of confidence. By the way, we just interviewed him, so you should totally listen to that podcast, because he has a lot of interesting things to say about DRL. And kudos to him for taking another podium win, which is really cool. But I found this to be very entertaining. You really saw a lot of good flying from a lot of pilots, but you also saw a lot of crashing again in these tight courses, in which, you know, at the very beginning, everybody tried to go conservative, you know, make sure that they can finish their races and get points. And when that didn't work out and the stress level started to amp up as they see the points totals, you know, roll out, all of a sudden everybody started pushing, and then all of a sudden you see more crashing because you saw a lot more pushing for the leads, and, you know, things happen. And it got interesting because of what's going on with people trying to get into the playoffs. But in terms of having really good racing and knowing who was the best on this track, it got a little muddy, you know, but I felt like this was a lot better than level 3, and just the racing aspect of it. And it's not something I can explain. I just felt like the racing was better. But it was also one of the facts where a lot of mistakes was still made by just being a little bit off your line. And it's like those tiny mistakes are so crucial. And, you know, it feels like the punishment is too high for, you know, just trying to have a minor edge. At least that's what I feel anytime I see these technical tight tracks. Kind of moving on from that subject, I also find it interesting to see the growth of all of the new pilots. You know, Jaws, McStrawley, Nurk. You know, this is the generation 2 of DRL, and you can see that they're learning and picking up the pace really quickly. You know, it's like at the beginning we were talking about, you know, the experience of the original DRL pilots and how they're dominating. And after just 4 races, you know, you're seeing that some of these rookies, if you can call them rookies, they've picked up on it super quick. You know, they've hunkered down. I've talked to them outside of, this podcast, and they really realize that, you know what, if I'm going to compete with the experienced vets, I need to hunker down and I need to seriously practice and make sure that I know this drone inside and out so that I can compete with them. And it really shows. It shows like how rapidly these pilots can learn and compete with the veterans. It's actually pretty amazing. All right, last thing that I want to cover before closing out this podcast is the fly off. And I find that the fly off, I didn't like how they decided to format it. Falcon X got to fly basically 7 more heats, even though he didn't finish in the top 2, which still put him out of the playoffs, which, I thought he was the clear winner to go in because he had so much more time to fly on the track. But sometimes luck doesn't roll your way. Congrats to Okbots, and I keep on messing up his name, but I want to call him Adam, but it's actually Atma. But anyways, congrats to those two. I felt like if you're going to have a race off in order to choose the pilots that finally make it in, you should have changed the course. I'm sure they had time to be able to do this, right? In which I'm not saying the whole course. I'm just saying that they should change up a few elements, let each of the pilots practice however many batteries they want to give it a little bit more of a level playing field for, a pilot like Falcon X, which they actually flew 7 more heats and just had a lot more, stick time and just recent stick time. But again, though, Falcon X didn't finish, so maybe my point is mute. But that's what I felt like what should have happened. I just don't really think that you should leave that open, for interpretation. You should just say, okay, there's going to be a race off. We know there's going to be a race off. We know it way before the event. So let's go ahead and plan some track element changes so that when that race off occurs, number one, there's a little bit extra content, and number two, it's a little bit more fair depending on, if somebody was racing that day for an extra 7 heats. That's just my thoughts on that. But, at the end of the day, the best pilot still won, and it didn't seem like it made a difference. But I figured I'd just dump that in there. That's all I have. I don't want to make this too long. I'm probably going to do one more one more podcast before the playoffs. I might do that. I will see. We also have plenty of more DRL pilots coming on to the FPV podcast. So if you like DRL, definitely stick around and watch those. Got some really fun and interesting podcasts coming out around DRL pilots.